Hi, welcome back to the second segment of the presentation for week 2 of Economics 360. We have thus far really discussed practically all what we needed to discuss about chapter 3, but if you still recall, we decided not to extend the previous session because we wanted to discuss two additional items just to make sure that everything is clear. And so what I'm going to do right now is really try to cover these two areas. One of them is just a quick refresher to make sure that we are all on the same wavelength and that you understand what is it that lies behind the theory of international trade and why is it that it is beneficial. While the second part, which might appear to be at the first look to be a little bit more complicated than it is, it really is very straightforward. Once you work it out, it doesn't really require any math whatsoever, so people always think that, hey, this is really very difficult because of the way it looks. It's really nothing else but very simple arithmetic. So without spending that more time on the introduction, let us just go ahead and proceed with what is it that we wanted to do. The first thing is really to deal with, as I said, I wanted to just stress the fact that we are all very familiar with what is essentially the major idea behind trade. In order to do that, you've got to remember the idea behind constructing a production possibility curve. All what it is, just as a quick refresher for those of you who might have forgotten some of your basic economics, is that you say, okay, I have a particular country, I know its resources, I know the state of the art, let's say the technology, and I know what are the two goods that I'm going to produce. And for the sake of illustration, we have to be limited only to two goods. So what do we do then in that case? Well, let's assume, just to make things very simple, that we have a country with 100 units of labor, and it takes 10 units of labor in order to produce 1 unit of a particular commodity. In this case, I'm calling it W, you can call it whatever you want. So if all of these resources are going to be devoted to the production of that particular commodity, how many can you produce? Well, in this case, it's going to be 10 up here. Let's assume, again, just to make things very simple, that the same 10 can be devoted to the production of another good, and again they will produce only one good. So in that case, if you take away all the labor out of this and you put them in the production of another item, again you will get 10. So what do we have right now? You have 10 and 10. We assume that the opportunity costs are going to be constant, which implies that this is going to be a straight line, just to make it very simple. So if this is a straight line, then all what we're suggesting that as you move from this point to this point, what is it that you're doing? You're exchanging some production of wine for some production of cloth. If it's a straight line, it only implies that level of that rate of exchange is going to be constant all throughout. So it's not going to change. That's what we mean when we speak of the assumption of constant opportunity cost. Therefore, what is the slope of the line? The slope of the line, which is the rate of exchange between one and the other. So really what we are saying over here is that when you speak about the domestic terms of trade, that's to say the rate at which you exchange one good for the other, it's nothing else but the slope of the line. Now, to make things very simple, I have decided in this case, let me see if I can bring this a little bit closer to the camera, maybe it will appear a little bit better. Now, in this particular case, what's going to happen, okay, this is probably a little bit better. I'm going to assume that there are two countries. So one country is represented by this line, another country is represented by this line. Remember the examples that we used earlier about Portugal and England, and each of them has a different slope, right? I am not using the exact numbers over here, so this is not an illustration of this, it's a general illustration. Therefore, you have two different slopes. That is, what is the meaning of that slope? Let's take this one, which is probably the one that is most obvious, the one that is more clear on the diagram. All what it means is that this country, to be fully employed, remember one of the assumptions that we spoke about was full employment, can either produce this or any of these combinations. It cannot produce anything outside of this line. Why? Because they don't have any resources for that. It is limited. So anything beyond this is not attainable. By the way, can it produce anything within this line? And the answer is obviously yes, because what does that mean then? It means that it's not using all its resources. So it's not fully employed. When you're in a recession or when you have high rates of unemployment, you're going to be somewhere over here. So what can this country do in order to increase, in order to move from this to a higher level of satisfaction? This country is not in a position to do that if it's not going to trade. The only thing that will allow that to happen is to go ahead and trade. But for that to happen, you need to be able to trade at a different rate than this. Because if you're going to trade at this rate, you just move along this line. So if you get a country similar to this country that will offer you a term of trade that is up here, then what can you do? Then you can produce over here and start trading up this line, i.e. you will be beyond that line that is limiting your production. So that society, therefore, will be able to increase its production given the same resources that it has, only because it specializes and then it trades with another country. Now this is the other country, remember? So this is one country, this is the other country. So this is one domestic terms of trade, this is the other domestic terms of trade. What is going to be the international terms of trade? It's got to be somewhere in between. So it will be, for example, this terms of trade. So this will be the terms of trade for this country. It will be able to go beyond the limits of its domestic production by trading. And this will be also the same terms of trade for the other country. So the important thing, therefore, to note is that given the resources that are fixed, given full employment, given that we know the state-of-the-art technology, then and we have also constant opportunity cost, therefore the slope of each production possibility curve is nothing else but the domestic terms of trade, while the slope of this dotted line, that's to say the one that is in between the domestic terms of trade, will be the international terms of trade. So they cannot trade at any rate, but they will trade at a rate that is somewhere between the domestic rates. They are limited by the domestic terms of trade. By the way, another small item to keep in mind when you talk about this is that if you're talking, say for the sake of the argument, about a very large country that is trading with a very, very small country, do you think that the terms of trade, that the small country will be able to influence the terms of trade of the large country? Not really. So there is a big difference, therefore, on whether you're really talking about trade relationships between a very small country and a very large country, or two countries that are of more or less of the same size. We'll have to discuss more the implication of this later on. But this is also one of the problems in the actual world when we speak about international trade. Because some of the outcomes that have led very many people to go ahead and disagree with the results of free trade are based also to some extent on this particular relationship. Now, to sum up this one more time, really trade is really nothing else but the idea of being able to take advantage of an efficiency of another country, and you allow the other country to take advantage of your efficiency. So you specialize in something, they specialize in something, and you trade with each other. Initially under Smith, this was thought to be possible only when each country has an absolute advantage. The important thing about Ricardo, which is the thing that rules up until now for all practical purposes, is that it is comparative advantage. Let's say one country can have an advantage in the production of all, but yet they can still specialize and they can trade and they can both benefit. And we did an example, a numerical example about that yesterday. So the only thing that I wanted to do right now still is to deal with this example about trade. Let me just, if you'll excuse me, turn off the slide. I think it's, yeah, okay, so a little bit better. We're going to do this example over here to show you the relationship between trade and wages. Up until now, we have been looking at things as if really everything is measured only in labor hours. It isn't very clear that all of us can relate only to labor hours, because whatever we do in this world right now, everything is expressed in terms of money. So I don't want you to think that money isn't important. Although initially, I mean, when the models were set up, they would work with or without money. But even once we introduce money, they're not going to change really the outcome that much. They're going to, you will see that there will be a relationship, however, that will impose itself when we're going to have to have trade. Now, this following simple example, try to follow it right now a step at a time. I decided to use the same numerals that we had used for the absolute advantage. This is to say that we have Portugal and England, wine and cloth. For Portugal, it's 2 hours and 10 hours. For England, it's 8 hours and 1 hour. Now, all what we have to do to understand this, initially, is that we're going to have to, one more time, remind ourselves of some of the assumptions. What was one of the assumptions is that we have perfect competition. What does that mean, really? What is the implication of that for the model? It means that the price is going to be equal to the wages. The price of an item is equal to the wages of that particular item. Because under perfect competition, those of you who again still remember, it means really that there are zero profits. So since the only factor of production in this case is going to be labor, if we pay labor $10, then we'll be able to get $10 and so on and so forth, right? So what is the price of an item, therefore? It's nothing else but the wage rate times the number of hours. To show you what is it that we mean by that in just a general format, in this particular case, let's assume that we're looking at Portugal. So I want to find out what is the price of wine over the price of cloth in Portugal. What is the price of wine in Portugal? It's 2 hours. And what's the wage rate? I'm going to call it W sub P. So I don't know what it is. It could be anything, right? So whatever the wage rate in Portugal, I multiply it by 2. So it is 2 W sub P, which is the price of wine. What's going to be the price of cloth in Portugal is going to be 10 times W sub P. So the wage rate that's being paid, we assume that it's the same wage rate, is going to be 2 W sub P over 10 W sub P. What happens to the W sub P's? They're going to cancel out. So what do you wind up with? With 1/5 or 0.2 if you prefer, right? So you find out that the price of wine over the price of cloth in Portugal is equal to 1/5 or to a 0.2. 20%, right? Now, what about in England? In England, again, we're going to do the same thing. What is the price of wine over the price of cloth? The price of wine in England is going to be 8W. The price of cloth is going to be 1W sub E, to make sure that we're referring to England. So it will become 8. Right? So what do we have to do right now? Well, if you look at this, who is it that's going to be exporting what? This means that England is going to be buying wine in Portugal. Why, by the way? Because of the prices. Wine is cheaper in Portugal, so the British are going to buy wine in Portugal. If they're going to buy wine in Portugal, let's see if we can set up this as an inequality. What we're saying, therefore, is that the price of wine in Portugal is less than the price of wine in England. Right? Now, there's the other commodity, which is exactly the reverse. We're going to be saying that the price of cloth in Portugal is greater than the price of cloth in England. And that's it. Now all that we have to do is to go ahead and use these figures to plug them in. So what is the price of wine in Portugal? Remember, it's 2W sub P. And this is going to be what? It's going to be less than the price of wine in England, which is 8W sub P. Over here, you're saying that the price of cloth in Portugal is greater than what it is in England. So you go ahead and you find out that it's 10W sub P, which is greater than 1W sub P. So far, really, we haven't said anything except to say, just to make sure that everybody is following. Based on this, we know how is it to calculate the price of everything. So we multiply the hours by the wage rate. So in Portugal it will be 2 times W sub P and 10 times W sub P. In England it will be 8 times W sub E and 1 times W sub E. The other thing is that we're going to set the inequality. The country that exports, why does it export? It exports only because the goods that it produces are less expensive than the other country, otherwise you wouldn't have any exports, right? So, if you set up the price of wine in Portugal being less than the price of wine in England, that's why the Portuguese are the ones that are exporting their wine, then you're saying that 2W sub P is less than 8W sub E. Now, the only thing that we're going to do, this is the only step, by the way, that's important. We're going to play around with this to make it a little bit simpler. So divide both sides by W sub E. That's to say, 2W sub P over W sub E will become larger than 8. Right? Now this is 2, so this means that W sub P over W sub E is less than 4. That's it. We do the same thing for this side. So we start with 10 W sub P larger than 1 W sub E. Now we can divide both sides by W sub E to get rid of the W sub E. So what do we get? We get 10 W sub P over W sub E is greater than 1. In order to get rid of this 10, so we say W sub P over W sub E is greater than 1/10. So what's the conclusion then? The conclusion is that the wage rate in Portugal over the wage rate in England must be less than 4 times. That is one limit. On the other hand, it must be greater than 1/10. So in order for this model to work, all what we're suggesting really is that even once you go ahead and use money, you'll find out that the wage rate in in Portugal over the wage rate in England is limited to this range. It is greater than 1/10, but it is less than 4 times. I mean, let's assume, just for the sake of the argument, that the wage rate in England is the equivalent of, say, $10. If the wage rate in England is $10, then the wage rate in Portugal, in order to have trade, must be larger than 1/10. So it must be more than $1. It cannot be less than $1. But it must be less than 4 times. So it's going to be more than $1, but less than $40. It could be anywhere between $1 and $40 in this particular case. If you change these, then obviously the rate also will change. But this shows again that as the wage rate changes, then that will affect whether trade is going to take place or not. So wage rates do play a role. And another thing, by the way, but I didn't include it over here because it will only add a very simple complication, and there is no need for it. That would have been the exchange rate. That's to say, we could have used one form of currency for England and another form of currency for Portugal. But the easiest thing is not to really worry about the exchange rate between the currencies and assume that it's 1-to-1. I mean, assume that you're talking about the United States and Canada and that the US dollar is exactly equal to a Canadian dollar. Or say, for the sake of the argument, you're going to assume that a euro is equal to a dollar. So that in that case, you don't have to worry about the rates of exchange. Now, I would like for all of you to maybe set up a particular, to make sure that you understand this, to set up a problem and see if you can work it out. Okay? Use any other numbers that you want, as long as they make sense. The easiest thing is to show an absolute advantage. Make sure that you set up a model whereby you show an absolute advantage and see if you can work out what will be the implications of wages on trade. Okay? So with this, therefore, I think this should conclude chapter 3, and for next week we'll start with chapter 4 and do maybe even chapter 5. Okay? Bye-bye.